Our story. What's happening? Our story, a story that you just might have heard the beginning of before, but stay with me, begins in June of 1942 in Czechoslovakia, in the Jewish community of a small town called Colen, just outside of Prague. Across Europe, Jewish items were being collected by the Nazis. Synagogue furniture, Judaica, and ritual objects, all intended to represent a religion that would not be allowed to survive. Somehow, in Colen, the furniture from their synagogue wasn't collected, but rather smuggled out of Colen, out of Czechoslovakia, all the way to Switzerland, where it ended up in the basement of a synagogue in Zurich. And that's where it stayed, because all of the Jewish people living in and around Colen, about 2,200 of them, they were also collected. Every one of them was sent to a concentration camp. And at the end of the war, there were so few survivors that no one came back to look for that furniture. And so it stayed in the basement of that synagogue in Zurich until 1988. 1988 was the year when our community here was in the process of designing what would become our new chapel, when Rabbi Foster saw an ad in a magazine for this furniture. And so he got on a plane and he went to Zurich. And on behalf of our community, he purchased the furniture and installed it into what would become the Feiner Family Chapel. And once this furniture became a part of our community, we called the Westminster Synagogue in London, where 1,564 Czech Torah scrolls were sent after World War II. We wanted to see if they had scrolls from Colen. There had been several, but most of them had already been placed in other congregations, and as the story goes, one remained. And so it began its journey to Denver. In 1942, that Torah was taken out of that ark in Colen in a moment that we have to imagine was full of fear and uncertainty. And in 1988, we put back that same Torah, Sefer Torah number 287 of the Czech Memorial Scrolls Trust, into that same ark here in Denver, in a moment that was most certainly full of hope and promise. Rabbi Foster was quoted in the Rocky Mountain News telling the 1,500 people who came to see the dedication in 1988, "You will remember this day because there will never be another like it. Today is the fulfillment of many dreams for many people, and we will be reminded more clearly than with any word or picture that Hitler could no more destroy our people than he could our Torah." For the first time, Rabbi Foster said, we will be replacing a Torah scroll taken from its home and returning it to the home from which it was stripped. We have the opportunity to keep these memories alive. And we have. I have told this story hundreds of times in my 6 years here at Temple Emanuel. Add to that the number of times the clergy over the last 36 years have told it, thousands. Thousands of times we've imagined that Torah scroll being torn from its home and the singular, almost miraculous circumstances that reunited them. Thousands of times we've shared these words while looking at the generations of the family of each and every single B'nai Mitzvah as we ask their grandparents and their parents to physically pass them that Torah, while also passing them the beauty and the values of our Jewish tradition. This past June, as we prepared for our special 150th anniversary B'nai Mitzvah trip, not to Israel, as usual, but to Colen, a place whose story has become such an essential part of our story, we wondered, What would it feel like to walk into that synagogue knowing that it had not been prayed in for decades? It felt huge. Rabbi Plack and Cantor Sachs and I got to tell that story, our story, in Colen. We celebrated 8 B'nai Mitzvah in Colen. We passed the Torah through generations of 8 families. We sat in chairs that have long been empty. We sang so loud, and we put our voices back into a space that no longer hears prayer, and we put Torah back into an ark that no longer holds Torahs, and we celebrated. And then we mourned. And we took turns reading every single one of the names we have of those from Colen who died in the Holocaust, whose names we say here. 10 of them every Shabbat. We said them there. And we wept for them. Because each of those 420 names represents a person whose life was cut short because of their Jewish identity, who should have lived 420 different stories than the one they actually lived. And while we didn't know them and we're not from there and it's not our home, we have held their Torah and told their story thousands of times, and so they are ours. Their Torah is now our Torah, and their story is now our story, and their names are now our names, and their loss is our loss, and that's exactly what it means to be a people. How do I know that we're a people, one people? There's a ridiculous story in the Talmud, as always, about a man with 2 heads. And the rabbis wonder, is he one individual or 2? And a kind of weird, but ultimately very profound suggestion is given. Pour boiling water on one of the heads. If the other head screams in pain, they're the same being. If not, then they are 2 separate individuals trapped in the same body. What are the rabbis trying to teach us with this story? If your pain is also my pain, then we are one. That's what happened to me in Colen as I wept through the entire service. And that's also what happened to all of us on October 7th. Boiling water was poured in another time or in another place, and we felt the burn. My soul has been burning for the past 370 days. October 7th was, for me and for so many of us, deeply personal. As the stories unfolded and the world began to understand the depth of the terror, we were filled with pain and with grief and with fear. We too felt the violation each time we learned of new atrocities, and we too were furious to learn the scope of this plan. We too were filled with longing for hostages we didn't even know. We too counted the days with Rachel and John Goldberg Poland, and we too wept at Hirsch's funeral. Boiling water was poured on those families and on our people, and we too were badly burned. Anthropologically speaking, this is exactly how Jewish peoplehood is supposed to work. We're supposed to feel connected to each other, to feel each other's pain. This kind of connection breeds attachment and emotion. It's how we know we're supposed to care about each other. It's why we've learned that we have to have compassion in times of joy and in times of pain. Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove describes a difference that might help us understand why that matters. He talks about Genesis Jews and Exodus Jews. Genesis Jews, he said, like our ancestors from the book of Genesis, see their Jewishness as a matter of personal choice. Abraham got to make a choice about his covenant with God. He opted in, and there were so many blessings because of it. Exodus Jews, on the other hand, they're Jews that don't get to determine their own identity through covenant and choice. They are Jewish because they are other. The first line of the book of Exodus reminds us that a new Pharaoh arose who did not know or trust the Hebrews. And so they were made slaves in Egypt, and their identity was forged by persecution and the struggle for survival. We separate between the positive pull of Genesis Jews. We opt into a relationship with each other because it feels good, and the negative push of the Exodus Jews. Not by choice are we pushed together as we are excluded from the world around us. We have been privileged to be Genesis Jews in a Genesis moment for a while now. For generations now, we've had the freedom to feel that positive pull of the Jewish community, to create our own Jewish identity and forge our own Jewish path. We decide what it means to have a relationship with tradition and ritual and with each other. And our Jewish values gently and beautifully remind us that we have the obligation, but also the opportunity to love the stranger. And we did, because it moved us and because we could, because the stranger let us, because we didn't have to worry about our own safety and well-being and freedom, so we had plenty of room to worry about theirs. On October 7th, we became Exodus Jews again, pushed together and made other again. That day marked the beginning of a global shift, and now we're the stranger again. Our sense of peoplehood is perhaps at its strongest when we're in an Exodus moment. Of course, it's easy to love the stranger when we are the stranger. And throughout this last year, we have become more connected, more of one people than we have been in a long time. Boiling water was poured in Kfar Aza and at Be'eri and at Nova, and we screamed. And now we all know what it feels like to be burned, and it hurts. And yet, even as we band together to process our own pain, and we have, our tradition won't let us forget that we have an obligation to the actual other, the real stranger, the one who is not pushed in with us, the one who is very different from us. If boiling water is poured on someone else and we don't scream, even when we are intimately aware of what their pain feels like, then we are turning our backs and ignoring their burn. And that is not who we are. We are the people of the story, of the book, of the words inside our Colen Torah scroll, which remind us who we are. We are the people who love strangers. We are the people who pursue justice and who love kindness and who leave the corners of our fields and who do not stand idly by the blood of our neighbors. We are the ones who argue with God to save the wicked. We are our brother's keeper. We are well aware that it does not diminish our love for the Jewish people if we scream when someone else is burned. My grief for my people who have been murdered is not lessened by my grief for the loss of Palestinian life, and neither is yours. Because it is that story and that scroll that teaches us pikuach nefesh, the obligation to value and preserve every life. My anger at Hamas is not weakened by my fervent wish that we could make peace instead of war, even though we need war. And neither is yours, because it is our story and our scroll that teaches Karata Alecha L'Shalom, that we are required to offer peace before we make war. My frustration and my fear at the rise of anti-Zionism and its conflation with or evolution into very real and very scary anti-Semitism is not diminished by my willingness to listen to and to love those who hold very different opinions than me, and neither is yours. It is our story that teaches us barzel bevarzel yachad, iron sharpens iron. And we are smarter when we give space to ideas that we don't agree with. I am not less of a Zionist if I feel compassion for others too, and neither are you. The words, "My heart is trapped in Gaza," that are inscribed on the Bring Them Home necklace that I have worn every day, those words are not less true. I am not invested any less in the safety and the security and the survival of the Jewish people and the state of Israel if I yearn for others' safety too. We can run for their lives in the park on Sunday and still hope and pray that the humanitarian aid gets to Gaza and the people who need it the most. We can hear someone's different opinion, even if it hurts us, even if it terrifies us, without automatically declaring it anti-Semitism. We are not less if we scream when boiling water is poured on anyone, anywhere. We are more. So make room at your tables, not just for the people that make you feel comfortable, but for the kids that are painfully struggling with Israel, and because of it, their Jewish identity, and love them and talk to them and be in the struggle with them. And make room for our community members who mourn the loss of Palestinian lives and mourn with them. Take a breath before you decide whether it's anti-Semitism or just a different opinion. That's who we are. We are a light unto the nations, and we give them and each other our best, even when we get the worst. And we know that's really hard, and it's really scary. And so we promise to be here with you as you figure out how to make that room or how to step into it. That is what it means to be a people, to have faith and confidence in the story and the scroll to which we so desperately cling, even when we're afraid of our survival, knowing that it will remind us of our humanity in inhuman moments. Isn't that wild? The story of the journey of the Torah scroll from Colen is a story that should teach us to be distrustful and afraid, to know only the dehumanization and desecration and destruction. But the story actually reminds us of the words on the inside of the scroll, those that compel us to be exactly the opposite, to be more human and more loving, to be more sacred and holy and whole. Those are the words that made that scroll worth fighting for in the first place. And now, having been there, to that synagogue in Colen, having seen it and felt it, having felt them, I wonder what those 420 precious souls would say if they knew that their ark had made it all the way to Denver with their Torah. If they knew how many times a week we tell their story, if they knew that we went all the way back to their synagogue to celebrate and sing and cry and pray in their honor and in their memory, in their space, because their story is our story. One of the B'nai Mitzvah parents said about the trip, the highlight was my child being called to read from the Torah in a historic synagogue in the Czech town of Colen. The world is broken in so many ways, he said. But when I find myself struggling to find hope, I remind myself that 80 years after my grandmother was on a death march out of Auschwitz, one of her great-grandchildren celebrated this moment at a synagogue in Europe. That reminder is what gives me hope, that life has meaning beyond what hurts us at this moment. It is so easy right now, full of fear, to turn inward. All of us in this Exodus moment who are being pushed together and made other, it is so easy to ignore the other. But I have faith that our great-grandchildren will tell this story, that they will hold our Torah and speak of how we survived this chapter, and we pass down to them our humanity and our compassion, along with our strength and our resilience. We are not less if we scream when boiling water is poured on anyone, anywhere. We are more. That's what it means to be a people, one people, the Jewish people, to have one story, one tradition that asks us week after week, year after year, to pass our scroll and tell our story. It means we stand here today on the holiest day of our year to look within, even when we are being pushed in, to be better, even when we are being burned. And so on this Yom Kippur morning, we pour out our souls to God. We scream at the burns we feel and the burns that we have ignored. We pour out our souls and we plead with God. Hear us. Help us. Forgive us.